just want to say that I certainly, again, have enjoyed spending time with you on Wednesday nights, working through some of the apologetic literature, and maybe down in the future we will perhaps start doing this again and kind of take up where we left off and start a whole new series. You never know. I want to go back to where I was before when I was describing the idea of the words that are used, particularly in the Old Testament, to reference evil, and so that we can kind of understand the nature of sin and the character of sin. And we had talked about several different things, words like iniquity, words like wicked, words like evil, transgression, and we had finally gotten down to abomination, which is one that is used quite frequently, particularly in the prophetic literature, but also in places like Deuteronomy. And so as I talked about here, you have the to'iba as the terminology here, and it talks about these kinds of despicable acts. And it doesn't have to be a sexual despicable act, but rather it's an act that is despicable in God's eyes. So I mentioned last time, for example, the fact that God used this word to describe the religious practices of people in the region, and included in that child sacrifice and sexual impurities. But I also wanted to add one that I actually added in the last day or two that you can just see, and I've given you some verses that you can look at here, but to give to you also a kind of sense of this, he also talks about the fact that when a person who is a follower of God is not living for God and are in rebellion, perhaps in rebellion, as Israel was, for God, when they made sacrifices, when they came to offer sacrifices in the temple, because their hearts were evil and they were doing evil deeds, God said to them that their sacrifices, and what he calls the sacrifices of the wicked, their sacrifices are abominations to him. They are that despicable to him because of the character that is associated with the person doing the sacrifice. In addition, you see in places like Proverbs the idea that God feels the same thing about a person who is arrogant, a person who shows an arrogant heart, that person is in fact, their life is an abomination to God. So I would say that in making kind of an application here, and I haven't made a lot of applications as we talked about these, but I would say an application here would be if we claim to be Christian or we claim to be a follower of God, going to church, maybe offering tithes, perhaps singing in the choir. I mean, it could be any number of things. For God, if you are living a life that is unrighteous, a life that is in rebellion against the things that God stands for, then those prayers that you make are abominations to Him. He does not see them as valid in reaching out to Him. So this kind of material is very strong, and God is trying to make a case that the heart is always the primary focus of spirituality. Okay, so I thought this is a part I've added in the last couple of days, but I wanted to give you kind of a sense of the New Testament words oftentimes used in the Greek to express sin as well. So you've seen all these that are in Hebrew, and I'll kind of make a summary of this in a minute, but let's talk about some of the New Testament passages that are out there. The word that is most often seen with regard to the New Testament is one that all preachers preach on, and it's the word hamartia. So sin is defined as this word, hamartia. and it is most commonly used. You really just about always find this as the word used to describe sin in some form or fashion, both really in attitude and heart, but also in actions. And you know that the basic framework, most likely you've heard in a sermon, the basic framework or definition of this is to miss the mark, wander off from the law or path of righteousness or uprightness. And so I gave you a few passages here that are helpful, and I'll just read them, a couple of them out for you so that you kind of get a sense of it. Jesus answered in John 8:34, "Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin, hamartia, is a slave to sin," hamartia. So the idea there is that person who practices sin has wandered off the path of righteousness. Or 1 John 3:4, which is one that we have dealt with in our study in these past few weeks. Everyone who makes a practice of sinning also practices lawlessness. Sin is lawlessness. Very interesting here in this section that in John's letter, he makes a real distinction of what John Wesley called habitual holiness. He is saying the person who practices these things, that's a recommendation of what they are, either in terms of being with God or against God. So if they practice sinning on a regular basis, sin is kind of part of their practice of life, that person is living in opposition to God and is not living in the light, as you remember he says so many times in John. Another word that we see here is the word flesh, or sarx. The actual way that would have been properly spelled would be S-A-R-X rather than K-S, but I'm saying it here in the way it would be pronounced. And that really can be two things. Flesh can be the fact that you have a human body. Jesus was born in sarx, that is, he was born in a human body. But it can also reflect the nature of a human being. And so in some cases, this will be defined as living in the flesh rather than living in the spirit. And so sarx will represent the idea that that person who is living in the flesh is living according to fleshly standards, according to worldliness in their life, according to their emotional senses, sensualities, all of those things. It's human in nature, but it is the way that we are living. And one of the verses that comes with this is Galatians 5, this 19 to 20, where it talks about the list of works of the flesh. And just you can kind of get a sense of what he's talking about here. This is not just a human being's body. Now, the works of the flesh are evident: sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and things like these. I warn you, as I warned you before, that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. Now again, we have to think in terms of practicing this. Sometimes people make mistakes. David made a mistake in having a relationship with Bathsheba, but eventually God rectified that circumstance and forgave because of their repentant heart. And the end result is you get Solomon being born. But here in this, you can just see that the kinds of things that are seen in terms of behavior issues are they range all over the board, and they are different. They can be an emotional outburst like fits of anger, where you lose your temper and hurt someone, or they can be rivalries, attitudes in which you're trying to outdo someone, put them down in order to raise yourself up, so forth. Another word that's shown throughout the New Testament is kakos. Now, I know that's funny, but the word evil comes from that. Probably kakos would be the way that one would say it. I didn't look to see where the accent mark was. But the sense of it is that it's a bad person's nature, or a bad nature, someone who is wrong or doing evil things, wicked or destructive behavior. And the two verses I picked out for this, Matthew 27:23, this one is actually Pontius Pilate, speaking about Jesus, and he said, why, when they're saying to him, kill him, his response is, why, what evil has he done? And they shouted all the more, let him be crucified. The word evil, what evil has he done? That word is kakos, and so it's talking about the fact that he's doing evil deeds. Mark 7:21, according to them. Mark 7:21, for from within, out of the heart of man, comes evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery. And so that evil thoughts, that's where the word evil, kakos, comes up and shows up in there. So, and that is, your mind is dwelling, the practice, as you see, the mind is dwelling on evil ideas and thoughts, letting those things have precedence. A last one that I would mention here is evil persons. So this is kind of like, you have evil, but now it's personified. It's in the life of someone. And this one, you have really bad-natured. They have a wicked nature. They think and do evil things, wicked things. So it's very similar to the previous word that we used, but it's used quite a bit to describe people who are living bad lives. Matthew 5:11, which is the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus uses this word himself. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil. There's the word poneros. All kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. So they are uttering untruths or evil, kind of evil thoughts for us, wicked ideas. They're attacking us. So the bottom line in looking at all these, I think, is that sin comes from both a heart condition and from the actions that originate in the heart. And Jesus certainly made that very clear in his life, in his teachings in his life. All right, so I thought at this point it might help to show you that people have thought about these issues for a long time, and they have been all over both the secular world and the Christian and religious world. I thought you might find it interesting to look at it from a secular point of view. And in this particular case, we're talking about a secular philosopher who is considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest, and that is the philosopher Aristotle, who was born, as you see here, 385 to 322. Just by definition, you ought to know that when he's writing, he is 300 years after the great prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah were writing their materials. And so that's why a lot of early Christian fathers maintained that many of the Greek philosophers had been reading the Torah and had also been reading in the prophets and had taken over some of their thought processes to come up with their own philosophies. Whether that's true, it's hard to say, but certainly they believed it. All right, in this particular case, Aristotle was trying to define what philosophers often call virtue, the idea that a person can be virtuous. And most of the philosophers, Socrates, Epicurus, the Stoics, they all were considering the question of virtue and how virtue is lived out. And mostly they thought in terms of morality. In this particular case, Aristotle gave to us what is called the golden mean of virtue. And I think it's quite interesting the way he defined this. He said that the virtue is the midway point between two sets of vices. A vice on the upper side, which is to an excess, and a vice on the lower side, which is a diminishment of something. And so one of the examples he used in his writing was courage, for example. Courage On the lower side, the side where it's been reduced, that courage is cowardice. A person is afraid, they don't have courage, or they lack in a great deal of courage. On the other side, you have foolhardiness. That is someone who recklessly jumps into things because they think they have courage, and the result is that they oftentimes get in trouble because they overstep. So I think that's very interesting that's actually a pretty good definition of how to find virtue in your own life, is to kind of realize that there are extremes on both ends, and the middle probably is the place where righteousness exists. Sin is thus kind of seen in this kind of golden mean in a little different way. Now I want to turn to one of our greatest theologians, St. Augustine, and you can also see that he is pretty much in a general time frame 100 years on the other end. He's in the AD or CE version after Christ, 354 to 430. One of our greatest theologians, and really his writings define the church for centuries. But in his wrestling with this case of what is in fact sin, he came to the conclusion that sin is in fact a diminishing of the good, that sin in and of itself does not actually exist. There is no living thing called sin. Sin is not a person, it's not a thing, it is taking something that has virtue and perfection and goodness and diminishing it or eventually destroying it. In fact, when that thing that exists, which makes it good by existence, when that thing is fully corrupted, it will be consumed and die, totally dead. He had a fascinating understanding of this, and the Enchiridion is his writing in which he is talking about this. Enchiridions were kind of these little pamphlets where you wrote things out as kind of your understanding of things. And in this one, I note for you here that what he really says, what is that which we call evil but the absence of good. But then I decided, okay, I might as well just put it in front of you. Since I'm going to be recording this, since I am recording this, you can actually stop it and you can get the quote completely if you like. This is a fairly long quote, so I'm going to read it and then, you know, I'll say a few words about it, but we'll go on. This is how he describes the question of evil. For what is that which we call evil, but rather the absence of good? In the bodies of animals, disease and wounds mean nothing but the absence of health. For when a cure is effected, that does not mean that the evils which were present, namely the diseases and wounds, go away from the body and dwell elsewhere. In other words, once you're cured, those evil things that have made you are not like those little creatures on the cartoons or the advertisements that are these, you see those little creatures that are bringing sickness and so forth. They do not exist outside of the fact that a person has been diminished in health. When the cure is effected, that does not mean that the evils which were present, namely the diseases and wounds, go away from the body, dwell elsewhere. They altogether cease to exist. For the wound or disease is not a substance, but a defect in the fleshly substance. And just in the same way, what are called vices in the soul are nothing but privations of natural good. And when they are cured, they are not transferred elsewhere. When they cease to exist in the healthy soul, they cannot exist anywhere else. Now, I think that's a really great look at this idea of sin. Sin is the diminishing of the goodness of the soul. It is the taking away of that which is healthy, and it's creating unhealth. So that when a wounded soul or a soul that has been corrupted is cured, when God heals it, this evil does not go somewhere else. But it is in fact completely destroyed and healed, and so the person is well. I added here the fact that sin makes bad that which is good, which would be kind of a way of summing it up. And I also added Wesley's definition of sin, because understanding this, that it's not something that jumps on you. Now, I know you could get into an argument. We could probably talk a little bit about demon possession and stuff like that, but that is not the same as a soul that has been corrupted by a person's willfulness and choice. But Wesley said, sin is a willful transgression of a known law. In other words, I know something that I should not do or should do. I know that it says it in God's law, but I choose willingly to break it myself because I just want to. And that's what he was saying 1,300 years later. And so it is a choosing to go against God. And so ultimately, as Augustine would say, it corrupts us, and every time we do it, it corrupts us further. All right, so having said that, the question then becomes kind of, what is the relationship of God to sin? If all the previous points are true, then we've looked at the fact that God is absolutely pure, and we've looked at the fact that sin is a diminishing of that which is good, and we've seen that sin oftentimes has the sense of rebellion and transgression, and it has the sense of doing that which is abominable to God. In this particular case, what that would tend to say to us is that God is not the actual cause of evil existing or the evil that we see all around us. Now, if God is in fact not the cause, then two pressing questions have to kind of be answered here, and that is, how did it get here? That's probably the most pressing one. How did sin arrive? And then the second one is kind of playing off of that. Why would God allow sin or evil to exist if he knew the devastation that it would cause in the human race? Again, some of these questions arise in such a way that they're defining whether they believe in God being all-powerful or God being all-knowing. But this is the question as to why we are asking, how does this all happen? And so, once again, I'm going to refer to St. Augustine in his Enchiridion, because he takes the whole question and just makes a short-term answer that I want to throw out there for you. One of the things that he says is that God would not have allowed evil to exist if he could not, in fact, overcome it in the end point. And I think I've said to numbers in classes or either in the times I've spoken that one of the things that we oftentimes read in the early fathers is they say that what makes God great, awesome, is not that he prevents any evil from coming to us or that does not allow us to do evil things. But what makes God awesome and omnipotent is that when evil comes to us, God can turn it into a good. He can bring something that began as evil and he can turn it in a different direction. So that's kind of the sense of it that he's getting at in this particular case. He is trying to help us understand that even though he knows that the devastation would happen, he also knew that evil could not destroy what he wants to make happen. And there are other reasons as to why he would not, in fact, actually prevent it from happening at all. All right, let's keep going here as we continue to look at these. So what we say is we look at this is God chose instead to allow free will to happen in the human creation. That's a big deal. Part of the reason here is not that God is creating sin, but that there is a reason that sin exists, and it comes down to the people that are doing the sinning. That ultimately, most theologians believe that free will is the reasoning that we have for evil in the world, the free will that came with us. And even though God foresaw that it would happen, he also understood that it was a necessary component of having love in his creation. A being cannot truly love who is not free to love, who is predetermined or coerced into a relationship. In either case, it's not love, it's programming. That's one of the things Isaac Asimov and some of the writers that have questions about AI and and science and computers. One of the questions that was always asked in these kinds of moral questionings was whether a robot that has been formatted and programmed can ever truly love. And so you have all these movies made that try to, kind of delve into that question as what can a computer actually or a robot actually do without free will. Their programming, even things like the Matrix, explored this on certain levels. It's necessary to have free will in order to get the rest of the components of goodness and relationship. Without free will, also, there will never be a foundation for morality. You cannot, even in the law, and I'm not a lawyer, so if you're watching this and you're a lawyer, don't come get me. But the reality is that we have defined law as premeditated versus action that is not premeditated. And so even in defining how we will punish a misdeed, oftentimes the question of the will is involved in deciding. If a person had no choice, had no ability to make a choice, the law finds it very hard. Now, again, the production of evil has to be dealt with, but the issue of what the willfulness of that person comes into play always as to whether this is an act done out of free will or an act done premeditated or not. That's always a question that's oftentimes brought there. And it's very interesting that this is, in fact, the message of the prophets. In fact, in the messages of the prophets, it's a continuous description of ways that God tried to cause Israel to change their ways from disobedience and transgression to obedience and willful love, steadfast love and fidelity or faithfulness. And he said to them, if you will stop in the behavior that you're doing and move back to the right direction, then you will in fact receive blessing. But if you continue to consistently refuse, then the next thing that happens will be judgment. And it's not based on the fact that they're programmed, it's based on the fact that they have made bad choices, and their choices then result in responses of some kind. And I would even go so far as to say that even the actions of the prophets for the good is actually an act of the will that can turn out to be good or bad. The Lord tells Ezekiel, well, it's very interesting. You get a case like Jonah. We dealt with Jonah not too long ago as a church. But you get a case like Jonah, and there's a very strong pattern there of God pushing him towards something because he is really interested in touching the lives of the Ninevites. You get the same thing with regard to Paul, because Paul, much like Moses, was kind of a hybrid. He was Egyptian, but also is Jewish. In much the same way, Paul was a hybrid of Judaism as a Pharisee and also Gentile, so that he kind of had a relational construct that helped him reach into both groups. But even the actions of the prophets kind of play out this storyline. The Lord tells Ezekiel that if he preaches to evil people to repent, and they refuse to repent, then it's on them and not on him. But then God says to Ezekiel, however, if you do not preach, in other words, you choose not to say the words that I've given to you, and they refuse to repent, then it's not on them, it's on you. In other words, I gave you a calling to go and do the ministry that would bring people to salvation or bring people to repentance, and you chose not to do so, and so therefore they were left in the lurch, so to speak, and they're not going to be receive the blame, you will. So what this tells us, that in a prophet's case, their will is involved in the action as well. They have a choice to say something or not say something, even if it makes them, as I believe Jeremiah said it, his insides burn when he doesn't say it. Even so, the prophet has a choice to speak for God or not. And the people being preached to have a choice to repent and turn from their evil or not. It all comes down to freedom of the will. All right, so now I want to look at some of the pathways of sin. Again, these pathways are not from God, and we'll kind of look at them as we go. And we're actually going to look at Adam and Eve to see a little bit about that as well. I think it's very fascinating. So let's start with the fact that we talked about James 1 a long time back, and we actually read it at the service that we did. In James 1, sin comes from our desire. You remember how it read? He says in James 1 verses 13 through, I believe, 15, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one." Verse 14, "But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. The desire," now parentheses here, "the desire acts on the will." Verse 15, "Then desire, when it has conceived," or parentheses, "or acted on, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death." And that means the corruption is complete. It ultimately, sin will corrupt the soul and destroy the life of the individual. Okay, so let's look at Adam and Eve here. I did a little bit of this yesterday with my Sunday class, and we talked a little bit about this. And I hope I've done a better job on the PowerPoint with this one, but you never know. In this particular case, as we look at the story of Adam and Eve and chapter 3, we kind of see the way that life is set up in this condition. So let's begin with who they are, the Adam and Eve, and what their relationship to God is, so that we can kind of understand the structure of temptation and sin. First thing we see in the passage is that they had an intimate relationship with God, in which there was daily interaction with the Creator. Now, interestingly enough, as we talked a little bit in the class yesterday, so if you were in that class and you're looking at this, I maybe make you laugh. But point is that part of that intimacy that they had with God was an absolute shamelessness. They did not sense that they were naked, or I don't know, naked, whatever it is we say. They did not sense that they didn't have clothes. They were absolutely free to be just the humans that they were created to be. And they had a relationship with God that was full of interaction, walking in the cool of the day and being together. And it would have been awesome to figure out what the conversations might have been. But at any rate, God perhaps explaining His creation, explaining how it all functioned. He had already said, "Be fruitful and multiply," and all those kinds of things. But there was just absolute innocence in everything that was related there. The second thing we see here is they were, in fact, differentiated. There was a male and there was a female, and they lived in natural companionship. That is, expressed kind of a mutual teamwork and a physical intimacy. As I said, they were told to be fruitful and multiply, but they were also told to have dominion over all forms of creation. So that would be in the naming, it would be in the way that the creation is taken care of, that humans were in a positive interaction in every direction. The third thing we see in this storyline is there was a restriction that was associated with that framework. And that is, God had said to them that there was something they were not to do. And that meant that on the positive side, they were to obey and submit to the authority of the God who made them and the God who was their creator. And so this submission to authority is where the sin nature issue begins to show up. So let's look at the way that the framework was attacked and broken. And this will help us kind of I think, work out some of this. When the serpent or tempter enters the picture, we get really no sense of threat or danger. So I want to start kind of from that process, okay? When the serpent shows up, the tempter, they don't seem like they were caught by surprise. We know that they would have been in proximity of the tree, because it doesn't say that she went somewhere to find the tree or the fruit, but it just says that she took from the tree. So perhaps the tempter was waiting in this particular location. Perhaps there had been conversation. Who knows? I mean, we don't really have any other information other than the lines that we see beginning in the process of the temptation. So as we look at this, let's kind of look at it from how it kind of plays out. In the first place, the serpent comes first. Did God actually say? And he really kind of raises the question of clarity. Is it really wrong for you to partake? Because did he actually say what you think he said? The knowledge of the right thing to do is already there. They know that they're not supposed to. But the temptation is based on the question of how much of a threat is the command. In other words, is the command something that is dangerous? Did they really hear him say that what they think they heard him say? And so he's kind of undermining the idea of what it is God has understood between him and the man and the woman. All right. Secondly, we have what the woman says. And we talked about this yesterday in class. Eat anything of any fruit, of any tree, of any bush, whatever. But we are not to take from that one tree. We're not to eat from it. And then she adds something that we have not been told to this point. We are not to touch it or we will die. We're not to touch it or we will die. Now we do know that the Lord says to Adam, the day on which you take this, or the day on which you do this deed, you will die. So we had a nice discussion about the question of longevity and the question of what is involved in that temptation there, and actually what the end result is. But we do know that he says on the day that you do break this rule, you will die. So that oftentimes the way that theologians look at that is, since they did not die physically immediately, this was more like a representation of the fact that they died spiritually. They died physically eventually, Adam lasting into the 900s, but they did not die immediately, like the statement. They did not die physically immediately. They died spiritually immediately. Okay. Now, the result then, it comes into the next question, that really, and begins with the idea that the serpent makes the comment that what they were told is a lie. You will not surely die. He's speaking directly to the trustworthiness of God. So, with all the walking in the garden with God, with all the time that they had spent, and certainly we did not seem to have days and years being measured here, but the point is that all of a sudden this individual comes into their presence and he immediately doubts. He brings doubt into questions whether God is clear, and also he brings an immediate rejection of God's statement. You will not surely die. And he speaks against the trustworthiness of God, and he says that God knows that you will be like him, and therefore you should understand it is worth the disobedience. So he brings in justification for the disobedience. You will be like God. Now, I brought up the fact that one of the claims Jesus made, and actually one of the things that they wanted to kill him for, was he called himself the Son of God or the Son of Man, and they knew that when he said that, he was referencing himself as absolutely one with God and therefore claiming to be God. And so several times when they picked up stones, they threatened him because he was claiming to be God. Well, here in this very passage, what we find is that the serpent is actually defining them by that kind of viewpoint. If you do this, you will benefit from it because you will become like God or gods unto yourself. And so here this becomes a matter of who's telling the truth here. Now, the knowledge of good and evil, I do want to bring this out just a little bit so that we can talk about it from this idea of knowing. And I didn't mean to handle the microphone there, sorry. But what the tempter does not say is how the knowledge is differentiated. There's one thing to know something or know about something, and there's another thing to actually know that thing. And so there is a knowing here that he is saying, God is saying, you are not to know sin, and so therefore you don't need to live into sin. I guess the best way that I could explain this, I tried to explain it yesterday this way, I can know that taking crack cocaine is a really bad thing. It can even be deadly for me because of all the visual evidence, the things that I've been told by experts and so forth. I don't have to have an addiction to crack cocaine in order to fully know cocaine, to know what it is, to know its component, how it's composed, or to know that it destroys people. It is not necessary for me to physically experience it, but that's exactly the kind of knowing that this serpent is trying to say to them. You will not only just know about this idea, but you will actually participate in it, and that knowledge will create in you a life of sin. And really, at the root of this is the idea of pride. It's a desire to be our own God. I'm going to answer to no one but myself. I did it my way, as Sinatra sang. This is why the number one sin in the Ten Commandments and of the seven greatest deadly sins is you are not to have any other gods before me. Because in essence, what you're really doing when you say that I'm God, I'm my own God, what you're really saying is I'm making an idol of myself, because there is only one God. And so this whole idea, it shows this rootedness in wanting to be God. And it goes back to what I said about Wesley's understanding that sin is a willful transgression. It is an act by which I choose willfully to say, I'll make my own decision. I don't care what God has to say about it. I will be my own person. And so the temptation is not going to come from God. It's going to come from you. It's going to come from that pride that says, dadgummit, I'm going to take this and I'm going to do this because I want to. And you know, what's that old saying, damn the torpedoes and full speed ahead. The idea is I'm going to do it. I just plan to do it. And that's something we learn very early. We just, even as children, we just are fearless in our willingness to do it our way. I was thinking about this, and again, in the letter to the first letter of John that we've been studying, and this is kind of paralleled in the writing of John in the second chapter in verses 15 to 17. We talked about this in class yesterday. Don't love the world or the things in the world. And if anyone loves the world, that they don't love the Father. But what's in the world? Well, he defines it as the desires of the flesh, and I would say that's a worldly mindset. That is, the flesh being my body. It's the things that I desire that are physically real in this world. Those are the things I want. The desires of the eyes, more of the sensual pleasures, you know, those senses that we have, feels good, tastes good, touch. What was it that Eve said? or how does it describe her sin? She looked at it. She saw that it was good to eat. How she knew that, we don't know. But she saw that it was good to eat and good to look at. And she decided, man, I like that. I think I'm going to take that. And oh, by the way, I mentioned this in the class yesterday, which I thought was is maybe a little bit helpful. And that is, when Eve does this, as she's having that whole conversation with the serpent, the tempter, Adam is right there, because Adam, when she takes of the fruit and eats it, she immediately hands it to her husband, who is standing there beside her. He eats it and participates. So the point of this is there's not a lot of character or courage or power or authority being shown by the man as he stands next to his wife as she fights the battle with the tempter, and all he does is yield to whatever she decides. Now, I get that in terms of, if you're going out to eat and your wife says, I want to go here, you go there, okay? That's just for me. But anyway, but notice here, the desires of the eyes, the sensual pleasures, and then the pride of life. And another translation for that could be pride in possessions. Here, it's all about one of the fathers defined pride. No, actually, I think it's C.S. Lewis. He defines pride as competition. It's not so much that I want everything, but I just want more than the next guy or the next woman. I just want to be better than that next person, running from the grizzly. I just want to be that one in front. That's kind of where we are in the way that we look. And notice that what John says here, this is not from the Father, it's from the world. And oh, by the way, the world's passing away along with its desires, and whoever does the will of God abides forever. So, okay, so that gets us kind of to the ends of some of these things. And what I want to do is kind of sum up this by talking a little bit about some of the formulas. But let me see here. I want to double check. Okay, let me just mention a couple of things that I did not put in the PowerPoint here that unfortunately I'm so sorry I didn't do. When we talk about sin, and I don't have a backboard that I could write on, but I'll say it a number of times so that we can do it. When we talk about the results of sin, there are several things that come out of this. There's first the fall of nature. Adam is told that the earth will have natural conflict between wholesome plants and non-beneficial plant life. And those of you who've ever grown a garden, you know what I'm talking about. Those bad things grow so much better than your good things. Even Paul describes the condition of the earth as one longing for redemption and restoration. An example of that is found in the letter to the Romans, in Romans 8, 20 through 22. The creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it. So you get that sense that even the creation has been in struggle. And then he closes that section by saying, for we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth unto now. So one thing we saw in the results of sin is the destruction of our environment, the destruction of the environment that humans lived in. A second thing we saw is the introduction of death. That's pretty logical. The fact is that eventually everyone died. So Adam, Eve, Seth, you had each one of the second generation and the third generation. And we do see that there is long lifespans for these. I noted that Seth is a son of Abraham, lived 912 years. Enoch lived only 365, but he was taken up into heaven without dying. His son Methuselah, however, lived to 969. We begin to see later that the numbers go down. Abraham, 175, his son Isaac, 180, and so forth. So the spiritual corruption begins to corrupt even the healthiness of the bodies that are living through these things. And we know the murderous intent of humanity. By Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, it tells us the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continuously. The third thing that we see are relational ramifications. I already mentioned some of these. The first thing would be shame is introduced. They realize that they don't have any clothes on, but again, that's not the issue. The issue is they're ashamed of their body now. Secondarily, there are results in their physical lives. Women will now have painful childbirth, and us men will never understand that, but that's certainly a very harsh thing. It will be very painfully hard to produce growth in our resources, and we will find that all of our struggles are to make our ends meet, and that becomes the natural thing. And even then, excuse me, it talks about the fact that there will be a natural loving relationship of a husband and wife, but the ramifications are that there will be conflict between them with regard to physical intimacy and conflict over relational leadership. So the effects in terms of relationships are great. The third thing we see in the relational is the deflection of guilt. Big deal here in that, Eve is the one said to take the first bite. Adam is the one who follows her leadership. God speaks to Adam first. Adam blames Eve, who blames the serpent. So there is this natural tendency of all human beings to say, I didn't do it, somebody else did it, or it must have just happened on its own, because I would never do that. So, that plays out in our lives pretty much all the time. Ultimately, the results of sin play out in our everyday lives. As we live under the authority and domination or influence of sin, we're slowly creating in our lives these patterns that will produce what we become. And I'm going to read about this a little bit later. I think I've got these things out of order a little bit, so I'm going to hold one of these and come back to it in a minute. But I do want to read one small portion from C.S. Lewis in a chapter on charity in Mere Christianity. And he says this about good and evil in our lives. Good and evil both increase at compound interest. That is why the little decisions you and I make every day are of such infinite importance. The smallest good act today is the capture of a strategic point from which a few months later you may be able to go on to victories you never dreamed of. An apparently trivial indulgence in lust or anger today is the loss of a ridge or railway line or bridgehead from which the enemy may launch an attack otherwise impossible. Let me see here. I'll come back to this one from his sermon that he preached in just a little bit. But what C.S. Lewis is trying to get across to us is the ultimate effect of human beings by the nature of sin and things. I think, in fact, I'll read this one for you, and if I have it again at the back, then at least you'll have a chance to see it. But in his sermon, The Weight of Glory, C.S. Lewis, talking about the results of sin, is talking about what happens to us in the ultimate and what happens to us in the end. And so he explains the movement between good and evil that we struggle in. And this is the way he describes it. It is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses. To remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, or else a creature, a corruption and horror, such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long, we are in some degree helping each other to one or other of those destinations. It is in the light of these overwhelming possibilities, it is with the awe and the circumspection proper to them, that we should conduct all our dealings with one another, all friendships, all loves, all play, all politics. There are no ordinary people, he says. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. Immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. What a great statement. I mean, man, that's worth putting on the wall. Anyway, okay, what I want to do now in kind of closing off, I know this is long, and I hope you've taken breaks, but what I'm going to do is there's some formulas I found over the years that I thought were kind of interesting formulas of good and evil and God. And so I'm going to put them up here, just go over them quickly. And since this is recorded, you can stop and use them and play with them in the future if you want to. So these are formulas about God and evil. And then I'm going to come back to C.S. Lewis later just to close out everything. Okay, so one of the formulas that you oftentimes see, the premise is, if God created all things and evil now exists, then God created evil. So this is kind of the way it plays out. God is the author or creator of everything. Secondly, evil is something. 3, therefore God is the author of evil. So God creates everything. Evil is something that exists. Therefore God is the author of evil. Now, a general response, I'm just giving you these as general fun responses, is the question of God creating evil. The argument would be God is the author or creator of everything. Evil is not a thing, as St. Augustine says, but a corruption of something else. 3, therefore God is not the author of evil. Okay, so here's another one. This is premise 2. If God made creatures perfect, you get that impression in Genesis 1 and 2. God made creatures perfect, then evil cannot exist in creatures. Thus, every creature God made is perfect. 2, perfect creatures cannot do what is imperfect. 3, every creature God made cannot do what is imperfect. Therefore, evil does not actually exist in creatures. The response, every creature God made is perfect. One of the perfect things that God made was creatures with freedom of will. Free will is the cause or source of evil. Thus, imperfection / evil can arise from perfection, not directly, but indirectly through freedom. He created the reality or fact of freedom. We perform the thoughts and acts of freedom or sin. Okay, and then finally, that means He made evil possible, whereas men made evil actual. All right, number 3. If evil exists, then God is neither all good nor all powerful. I think Hume used this argument. If God has the power to prevent evil, and if God is all good, then the fact that He does not correct evil means He's evil or He's not all powerful. All right, so let's kind of hit that one. If God is all knowing and all good, He would destroy evil. Secondly, if God is all powerful, He could destroy evil. Third, evil is not destroyed. Therefore, God is neither all good or all powerful. The response to number 3, if God exists and God is neither all good or all powerful. Argument, if God is all good, He would destroy evil. Number 2, if God is all powerful, He could destroy all evil. Number 3, in our current state of being evil, evil cannot be destroyed without destroying freedom of will. Number 4, therefore evil is not destroyed. God remains all good and all powerful, but He has allowed evil because of free will once again. Whoops, got this one out. Funny. Okay, if God was good, He would not send people to hell. Now this one, we could play with this one a lot more. I didn't have time to deal with this so much. So this is just one I've seen that I thought was kind of interesting. The greatest good is to save all humans from hell. Even one person in hell would be less than the greatest good. Therefore, God cannot send anyone to hell and have the greatest good. And then number 4, I put these in today, so that's why they didn't fly in. Response to number 4, if God was good, he would not send people to hell. Number 1, the greatest good is to save all humans. Number 2, even one person in hell would be less than the greatest good. However, if God forces someone to go to heaven, then their freedom is destroyed. Thus, God does not send anyone to hell. They choose for themselves their destination. So, that leads me to kind of the final statements here. The first one will come from C.S. Lewis, and it will be the idea of what C.S. Lewis said in The Great Divorce. Ultimately, it comes down to the fact that there are 2 kinds of people in the end. Those who say to God, thy will be done. And those to whom God says in the end, thy will be done. So in other words, if a person ends up in hell, it will be because God said, thy will be done. If they end up in heaven, it will be because they said to God, thy will be done. Now the last, I have several verses that could go with that. But we can look at that some other time. This is the final section from Christian Behavior and Mere Christianity, Book 3. I thought this is, I guess, to talk about the results of sin and how sin plays out. I felt like this was a good closing for this whole section on evil. And that is, we have a say in the kind of person we're becoming. And so part of the problem that goes on here is the fact that I am slowly but surely turning myself with the assistance of God or against God toward one of those 2 creatures we described earlier. So look at this quote. And taking your life as a whole, with all your innumerable choices, all your life long, you are slowly turning this central thing either into a heavenly creature or into a hellish creature, either into a creature that is in harmony with God and with other creatures and with itself, or else into one that's in a state of war and hatred with God and with its fellow creatures and with itself. Each of us at each moment is progressing to the one state or the other. So I hope that kind of gets us to the end here. I hope this has been an interesting section of apologetics. If you have questions, you certainly can send them to Jeffcoat at fraser.church. But key points that free will is a big deal. It's our freedom to choose to follow Christ or to reject Christ. And God is a God of love and power and authority, but that is not undermined by the fact that we have free will. So I hope that each of you have a great day, and it's been a blessing to be a part of your life.